the whole sort of premise of a robotaxi is that it makes a car trip that much easier. And something gets easier, we find more ways or reasons to do it. People might be shifting from transit or biking or walking to a robotaxi. I mean, some people will take trips that we never would have otherwise taken at all.
Welcome to the Rideshare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
David, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good. Good to see you.
I probably should have done a little more research, but now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if this is your second or third time on the Rideshare Guy podcast, but I know you've been on before.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, Harry. I don't know either, but we've done this before, and it's always good to see you. So whether it's the second or third time, I'm glad to be back.
All right. Luckily, I'm a great Googler, and I see you came on in episode 101 in July 2019. We talked about what data can do for cities, and then I remember our more recent episode 159 in February of 2023, and we talked all about Uber Transit and sort of I think their three legs of the stool there. So
I think that was February 2022.
2022. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Because Uber Transit was dead as of February 2023. Sorry, go ahead.
Very nice. Well, so for those, I'm going to leave a link to your past episodes on the podcast. It might have even been 3 times, to be honest, now that I think about it. But I'll leave a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to catch those, because I think some of those are still relevant, and we're going to touch on some of that today. So for those who may not know you, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So I do a number of things. I am a visiting fellow at Harvard at the Kennedy School, where my work focuses on transportation technology and policy. I have a long background working with cities and working with startups, both separately, one then the other. And I'm really interested in ways that urban mobility technology shapes cities and affects urban mobility. And I've written probably at this point well over 100 articles about urban mobility and tech, everything from autonomous vehicles to Ridehail to scooters and even sidewalks and transit.
Yeah.
So it covers the gamut.
Yeah. And I think that, I'm kind of curious, do a lot of people know you more for your journalism work? Because you're a very prolific writer. I feel like you're writing at least an article every week or two, and, The Verge and all these main, Bloomberg and all of these top outlets. But I know that you do other stuff, as a consultant and with cities and things like that. So I'm just curious, like if you talk to someone or meet someone in the industry, how do they think of you?
Yeah, I think people know me from the articles I've written in places like you mentioned, The Atlantic and Washington Post and The Verge and Vox. But what's fun about it is then I have people reaching out to me to ask me to come talk sometimes, and every now and then there's an organization or a startup that aligns with my own interests, and I'll be very transparent. Like, my general perspective on urban mobility is that cars have really been a deep problem in urban America, and technology could potentially help us find solutions to those problems. So sometimes there's companies and organizations that are aligned with my own views, and we end up finding ways to collaborate.
Got it. Cool. And so would you say that your number one issue is, I don't know, I'm not going to say anti-cars, but, getting more cars off the road through tech, or what's the one thing that you kind of care most about these days?
Yeah, I think that my true north is that, 100 years ago in the United States, we rearranged our urban streets to accommodate fast car trips. And I think that was sort of like an original sin. And I'm most interested in ways of using policy and technology to sort of try to mitigate the damage I think we're still doing to ourselves, whether it's from climate or civil society or safety from having these cars going so fast everywhere. Yeah, that's kind of how I approach it. But to be totally honest, I get excited about individual like pieces of the puzzle. Like, I love e-bikes. And I'm very skeptical about robotaxis, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So, I delve into those areas and nerd out, and then I end up writing about it.
Very cool. Well, and I think that, the couple things that I appreciate you, and I think it's nice that you set the stage there, is that, one, I feel like a lot of the topics that you're covering or the things you're working on are also the things you're passionate about, the articles that you're writing, right? It's not necessarily like, hey, this is my day job, this is what I'm covering. It sort of aligns with things you're interested in or where you think there's opportunity to improve. And then you also said something interesting, policy and tech. I feel like usually those are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And it's like, hey, we're going to force people to get out of cars, or, hey, we're going to force people we're going to flood the street with 1 million scooters, right? And I think that there's so much more opportunity in the middle. Like, hey, let's create, if you want to get people out of cars, let's create a better product. Let's make transit better. Let's make scooters, more available, right? E-bikes, get delivery drivers out of cars, whatever it might be. And so I think for me personally, that's kind of, I know we don't agree on everything, and I'm sure we'll find a few things, hopefully, to disagree on and make this podcast interesting today. But I think kind of like that, those blending of ideas is where I think you always have a great perspective. And that's why I'm excited to have you on again.
Well, thank you. That's really nice of you to say. I do feel like there's sometimes are unfortunate silos between those who focus solely on like policy and
Mm-hmm.
regulation and those who really like believe in technology's power to improve our lives. I am interested in both perspectives and I share ideas with people who have both perspectives, but I hope that we can find areas of overlap between those who are sort of techno utopians
Yeah.
and those who believe that we need regulation and say like, look, there's actually a world here where we can actually really make progress and everyone can understand the value there. That's what I strive for, at least.
Yeah, very cool. Love it. So we recently met in Austin for the first time during Move, I think, mobility conference. And I don't know
Yeah.
how this idea came about, but somehow we left with the idea that you were going to write an article. And here we are a month or two later. Title of the article, I don't know if it's been changed, but Ridehail has made cities more polluting. Robotaxis will too. How does that sound to you?
The title is probably going to change from that because we're
Okay.
recording this just like a day before it runs, but the
Putting the
gist of it
pressure on
is
the
there.
editor.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's frankly we probably want to record over this, but it's going to be something like Uber didn't Uber was didn't improve the didn't address climate didn't improve I can't speak. It's gonna be something like Uber didn't improve the climate
Hmm.
and robotaxis won't either. In fact, you know what?
I
Rather than
like that.
speculate, why don't I actually tell you what it is? Hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry for you have to edit this shit out, but whatever.
All right.
Um,
Joey will edit it out, or if it sounds funny, we'll leave it in and
I
really
got
let
it.
the
Okay.
people have it.
Say, yeah, so we're recording this just as a new article of mine is coming out in The
Hmm.
Verge, which you gave me really the idea for when we met in Austin a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, I should say, which was a lot of fun hanging out with you. But the tentative title, which sometimes the title can change, but it's going to be Uber failed to help cities go green. Will robotaxis too? Question mark.
Hmm. Interesting. So, what was why'd you want to write this article, and what was sort of the quick takeaway? We'll leave a link in the show notes so people can dive in, but I think there's a few points we'll expand on today.
Well, you know this because we had that fun conversation over
Hmm.
overpriced cafe lattes in Austin as we were like just sort of shooting the shit about this. But it is striking to me, and I think to you too, that people talk about robotaxis as this totally new way to travel. It's crazy, it's
Hmm.
unprecedented. But when you actually get down to what the experience is of hailing a cruise or a Waymo vehicle, it's really just like like hailing an Uber or a Lyft.
Yeah.
Like you're holding up your phone, you're requesting a ride on it. The car comes, picks you up, brings you somewhere, and drives off to pick up its next passenger. It's just Uber without the driver. And to me, there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from what robotaxis will do for society and for cities based on what Ridehail already has done. And I'm not sure that I've seen a lot of people sort of capitalize on the knowledge that we've gained from Ridehail's experience of the last 15 years to help us understand what a future of robotaxis really could entail, assuming that robotaxis get their technology to work,
Yeah.
which is a big caveat right now because we're recording this as Cruise is in a crisis with basically they're not able to run or they've now voluntarily suspended all driverless
Yeah.
operations, but they were sort of forced into that by California cracking down on them. But if the tech works,
Hmm.
my hypothesis is that the experience of having a city full of robotaxis will be basically like having a city full of ride hail, but on steroids.
Yeah. So we're definitely going to kind of answer that hypothetical if the technology works. But before we get there, let's focus on the sustainability because I think it seems like that was a major piece of your article. And when you
Yeah,
say sustainability, what do you mean? Are you talking EV? Are you talking miles? Or how do you sort of define sustainability in the context of robotaxis and ride hail?
fewer emissions,
Fewer
um,
emissions.
particularly looking at greenhouse gas emissions because of the urgency of fighting climate change. But
Hmm.
also, secondarily, I think that sustainability relates to other types of emissions from mobility, which can include emissions from tires, from brake dust, and
Yeah.
from road dust, which we're really only starting to learn is really quite bad. But that's how I think about sustainability.
Got it. Yeah, I know you've done a few good articles recently on sort of I guess you would call it pollution from tires and EVs and some of these kind of secondary
Yeah,
sources that, if you're an EV driver, you probably realize, wow, the tires wear out a lot faster, right? Than on a normal car, 20 to
literally.
30,000
Right.
miles. You're kind of easier to drive faster. The cars are heavier. And, so it's sort of a lot of factors working against you, right?
Yeah, no, there's actually an interesting. You're right. I wrote a couple stories about tire wear and tire pollution, which we're really only starting to learn about. But
Hmm.
it's kind of terrifying when you sort of understand what scientists have discovered so far. Like there's a particular chemical in tires called 6-PPD that can just totally wipe out fish species, even in
Yeah.
minuscule concentrations in water. But you're exactly right. EVs, because of their added power and weight, just shred tires. Like that's
Yeah.
the number one complaint from JD Power
Hmm.
when they did a survey of EV owners was that our tire the number one complaint about their tires was that they wear out too quickly. They perform okay, but they wear out fast. And wearing out fast means more pollution from those little bits and pieces of tire that float into the air. So 100% agree with you. There's this awkward trade-off where EVs may reduce or eliminate the like tailpipe emissions, but actually contribute to other types of emissions that are really bad in ways that go beyond what their gas powered equivalent models would produce.
Yeah. So if robotaxis continue on this path that they're on, excuse me, and I know that there's a lot up in the air still, but what do you think their biggest impact will be for society or cities?
Well, I mean, if robotaxis work technologically, the whole sort of premise of a robotaxi is that it makes a car trip that much easier, right?
Hmm.
Potentially cheaper too, because you're no longer paying for the driver. That's why Uber was so interested under Travis Kalanick
Hmm.
and Kalanick, I should say, in developing AVs back in the day. But if nothing else, a robotaxi is intended to make it so easy to get from
Yeah.
point A to point B in a car that we have a lot of evidence. There's a theory going back 150 years called the Jevons paradox that shows that when something gets easier, we find more ways or reasons to do it. So not only does it mean that people might be shifting from transit or biking or walking to a robotaxi, also means some people will take trips that we never would have otherwise taken at all in a robotaxi. And on top of that, because the annoyance factor of a commute in a robotaxi is intended to be lower than it would be if you're driving, because driving is a nuisance, conceivably at scale with robotaxis, there's good reasons to think that people are going to say, you know what? As I think of where I'm going to move with my family, the commute's not so bad anymore because I can go in a driverless car. Why don't I just move a little bit further out from the center city because the commute doesn't really bother me. I can get a bigger house there. That's
Yeah.
sprawl. And if you end up sort of doing that across thousands or millions of people, you end up with a sort of like urban footprint that is terrible for cities and could basically really undermine transit and lead to a whole lot more driving than we see now. A lot more gridlock and traffic too, because the cost of gridlock also is lower theoretically if you're not sort of like sitting there annoyed as you're
Yeah.
gripping the steering wheel stuck in a traffic jam. So that's what I see the inducement of more driving as the most likely outcome of scaled robo taxis and the biggest concern.
Yeah, I think that the case you laid out is pretty compelling. I think that it's hard to argue against the fact that, hey, even if this technology works out a little bit, even if it's a little cheaper, even if it's the same, I think that there will be more trips. Have you found a good argument against that? Would the companies say no, that's not going to happen, or and I like how in your article you cited a few good examples. Hey, Uber and Lyft have pulled 1 or 2% compounding annually away from transit. That they've sort of, there's
Right.
other studies that have showed, they've added to congestion. I still think a lot of the studies, it's less than 10%, right? So it's like not the 90% of vehicles on the road, but yeah, they are making traffic worse. They are adding trips. So I don't really see an argument where you could say that, hey, that's not going to happen.
No, I really don't either. In my experience, robotaxis really don't want to talk about the sort of like induced demand for additional car
Hmm.
trips that their products could produce. But you're exactly right. Like in the Verge article, I sort of explained how, 15 years ago, you were probably watching Ridehail like I was, Uber and
Yeah,
Lyft at the time.
I think I was doing it.
And yeah, you were doing it. Yeah, I wasn't doing it. I was watching it. And you remember remember how often people would say, "Oh, the car sits
Yeah,
unused 95% of the time." When we people are taking Uber and Lyft, we're
right.
going to see this dramatic reduction in car use and driving, and it just hasn't happened. You
So
get
I
more congestion when ride hail
Yeah.
comes
So
to
I think,
town.
to be fair, it's very easy to say that now when there's so much data and so much studies, but I think it was a compelling pitch. If you think back to Lyft, right, they were literally getting people, like, it was a car share, sort of a ride sharing model. It was literally a ride sharing model. They were getting people in the front seat, it was like, hey, are you already going here? And so I think that, it's kind of easy to look back now and say, oh, that was, total BS. That was never going to work. Right. But do you think that there was some legitimacy that, like, hey, back in the day, hey, maybe this could be a good first last mile connector to transit? It's sort of, as you mentioned and showed, and I think we talked about in your last appearance, it's not a great experience. When I did my first trip trying to pick up a passenger from the downtown, expo line, it was like a chaos. It was a mess, right? That's definitely not going to work. But I think that's, like, I guess my point is more like, I feel like for ride hail, I think some of those early pitches, like, hey, you got to try it out you got to try it out to see if it works or not, or it made
Yeah,
sense.
no, I think that's fair, Harry. Like, I can't get into the heads of the most senior executives at Lyft and Uber in 2011 and understand if they were saying this stuff like, "Hey, we're gonna save transit, we're gonna reduce car use in your city," if that was totally cynical or if they
Mhm.
really did believe it. It's possible they
Yeah.
really did believe it, and I think probably better to give the benefit of the doubt. But now in hindsight, we have a lot of research into
Right.
this, and you just meant like just focus on the transit piece because you remember all
Hmm.
these arguments about how Uber and Lyft are going to be first mile, last mile
Yep.
connections for people to reach transit, and transit would find new riders that way. The federal government actually funded some pilots to explore this, and it basically is just not true. Nobody really takes ride hail to and from transit
Yeah.
regularly. Like you said yourself, as a driver, the experience sucks. You can't
Yeah.
find the
And a
passenger, but
passenger.
passengers also can't afford it. It's not good that
Yeah.
way either. And then there's I think a really important study. And it's not the only one, but this one I'll focus on
Mm.
by a guy named Greg Earhart at the University of Kentucky, who found that when ride hail comes to town, the average transit agency is going to lose between 1% and 2% of riders every year
Yeah.
compounded. And that's not just from people switching from transit to ride hail, which is kind of intuitive. It's also because ride hail can create extra congestion
Hmm.
in the downtown core in particular, which slows down transit service and makes it less reliable.
Yeah.
And that could drive people away as well. So this idea of like a synergy, which we were sort of like a symbiotic relationship between transit
Yeah.
and ride hail that we talked about 12 years ago, it's just
Hmm.
not true. And I don't know why it would be true with robo taxis either, to be totally candid.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely the data is clear now, and I think it's fair. I mean, I think you did a good job in your article. You cited that, Lyft has invested in City Bike and Uber bought Lime, right? So they are, I think that they are trying, I mean, Lyft has a partnership that you mentioned in your article with, where you can do tickets or transiting tickets right through their app, stuff like that. So it's sort of, to me, like, I think the companies, the ride hail companies are trying, but you're right. It's not the best fit. It's not the best experience, the best product. I guess my one sort of, we don't need to turn this into a whole transit episode, but my one thing
No,
that
it's
I'd push
fine.
back is sort of, like, hey, if you're here in Los Angeles taking the Expo line from Santa Monica to downtown, like, why are people, not taking that and taking an Uber instead? Like, the transit line, it's dirty, it may be unsafe, it's not even timed with the signals, you know what I mean? So you're literally like waiting, Uber and Lyft might be adding to more traffic, but like there's also, I think, some responsibility on the transit agencies. They need to have a better product, right? Like, why are people picking that solution, right? It's not, no one's forcing them to take Uber and Lyft. And if anything, the cost is 5 to 20x. So I feel like I don't want to completely, there's some kind of negatives there, but some of them I think are kind of self or own goals.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, transit agencies sort of like they play the hand they're dealt when it comes to the amount of money that they get.
Hmm.
And I won't speak specifically about LA Metro because I don't know the details of the situation there. But if we care about minimizing emissions from our
Yeah.
transportation system in a city like LA, we should societally want as many people as possible to voluntarily opt for
Yeah.
metro instead of taking ride hails. It's better for the planet. It's better for our health. It's better for all that good stuff. And we haven't really funded transit systems in the U.S. in a way that makes them as
Yeah.
competitive as I think they should be.
I agree. And that's sort of where I've always kind of been a fan of the idea. Hey, if you are taxing Ridehail or, charging congestion pricing in New York, use that money to then fund transit and make those opportunities more attractive, which I think we're starting to see some of. So, I think the other,
Can I
yeah,
point one thing out? It's just something
sure.
interesting. I'm curious if you have a perspective on it. It feels like there's a real tension between ride hail and transit, or just climate issues, for in a sense that ride, if you want to get passengers really quickly without a whole lot of deadheading on the way, it seems to me that you want to have your ride hail vehicles be concentrated in the downtown core of a given city.
Yeah,
Is that right? You're nodding. So I
definitely.
think you're right. That's exactly the place of a city that's going to have the most bike lanes and the most bike share and the
Yeah.
best transit service. So there's a real tension there, I think, between shared rides and the provision of truly sustainable mobility services. You like the societal value of ride hail, I think, is much greater in the more suburban or
Yeah.
exurban areas, but I'm not sure that's where the business model works the best. I was
Yeah,
curious
no, I think you
what you
brought
think
that
of
up
that.
in your article, and it's very important. It's sort of like, to me, why I really like this article you wrote is because, hey, there's all these learnings and things we've seen from Ridehail. Like, if robotaxis actually work out, this is going to be times 10. Like, all the like congestion issues are going to be a lot worse, right? I mean, there's going to be more people taking trips, and you're definitely right. I mean, Uber and Lyft literally incentivize drivers with maps or with pricing, and it's like, if you look at the kind of surge maps, I've done a couple articles on this, and if you line it up with the higher socioeconomic areas or the more dense areas, that's where all the trips are. That's where they're telling you to go. And you are right. That is where bike lanes and more eco-friendly, options. So I think you're right. I think there's a bit of an inherent tension there, right? That city, it's sort of important to understand both sides. What do you think is the company, like the robotaxis companies, the Cruise and the Waymos, like what is their biggest claim? Like, why are they going to be so good? They must be saying something. Why are they saying they're going to be great for society or cities?
Well, they claim that they'll be helpful for safety. You've probably
Okay.
heard those arguments before, which feel kind of hollow in the wake of this horrific incident in San
Yeah.
Francisco on October 2nd, where a woman was dragged underneath a cruise vehicle. And for other reasons, we have to get into that here. I think the
Hmm.
jury is out on whether robotaxis are actually safer than human drivers. But from a sustainability perspective, I looked into this and I asked for comment from
Hmm.
Waymo and Cruise, and they talk about their the fact that their fleets are entirely electric, and they've tried to source the power for those vehicles from sustainable sources like wind farms and things like that. I think it's harder to do when you start scaling to maintain
Yeah.
that, but I appreciate the effort. And they also say that from a sustainability perspective, we will be better than ride hail because we are incentivized to minimize deadheading in a way that an individual Uber driver who is his own company,
Hmm.
basically, right, is not incentivized, because the fleet of robotaxis are owned by the company, right?
Yeah.
So any mile that they're not holding a passenger, the company is eating that expense. So they argue that they'll be able to deploy the robotaxi fleets in a more efficient way than an equal number of ride hail vehicles driven by effectively individual entrepreneurs who go wherever the hell
Yeah.
they want, incentivized by Uber or Lyft, but still wherever they want. Those are the arguments that Cruise and Waymo make. I find them less than fully compelling, because the goal shouldn't just be to be a little bit cleaner than ride hail. The goal should actually be to build the greenest mobility transportation networks that we can in cities. And I very
Yeah.
much worry that robotaxis are aligned with that goal.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of find that argument a little weak. Their argument, not yours.
Okay. No, no, please.
I mean, it's like not that compelling. Hey, we're a little cleaner than Ridehail. We've got, Uber is like, we're going to have all EVs by 2030. I think they said that, now
Yeah.
10% of their miles in California are, EVs, right? Because it is, the intersection of Ridehail and AVs. It's a great fit. If you're a driver doing 1,000 miles a week on your car and, gas prices are $6 a gallon in California, you can imagine if you have good access to charging, that break even point is very quick. I don't know, minimize like Uber and Lyft drivers. I would say, if anything, they're very incentivized to not have dead time because they are responsible. I don't know why a
Oh,
fleet would
interesting.
be,
Okay.
more. If anything, one thing I have seen, I was in Dallas recently and I took a bunch of altos with Ridehail, employee drivers. And one thing I do
Yeah.
find at airports, like getting picked up at LAX by an Uber and Lyft driver versus, an employee driver that's paid per hour, they're actually less incentivized to take all the little shortcuts and hey, call you and say, hey, come meet me on the top floor because, there's less traffic there. Like they're kind of paid either way in that fleet capacity. And so I don't, it's a little different with robo taxis. I don't know if you can program in, like that hustle. Like a lot of individual
Interesting.
drivers have hustle, right? That in create, you're picking up at a big sports event, outside of DC. And it's like, I'm not going to go to the waiting lot where I have to sit in traffic for 20 minutes. Why don't you walk 10 minutes, come pick me up there? And
Hmm.
then, I'll get in and out quicker. I'll be able to do more rides. So I don't know if I find that argument more compelling. I think to me,
Hmm.
their opportunity would be on the safety side. I think that is, we can talk about how feasible that is or not, but I think, Cruise sort of famously took out this full page ad, I think in the New York Times, talking about, oh, there's 40,000 driving deaths a year. And I'm a little skeptical of that claim. Like what do you think about their safety claim? Do you think they can, like if they're adding more trips to the road, how are they going to reduce, if let's say we're at 40,000 deaths per year, which is horrible, and everyone knows we got to get that number down. Now Cruise and Waymo come along and they add a bunch of more trips to the road. Now their trips may be safer, but they're still going to have some accidents. So on a marginal basis, aren't there going to be more accidents and deaths? If anything,
So
won't it be
that
the
is a,
opposite?
I think that's actually a very savvy point because because if you're going to have more driving in a world with
Hmm.
lots of robo taxis, you're all else being equal, you're creating new opportunities to crash.
Yeah.
Even if the marginal mile is safer, more driving means more chances to crash. So that is a risk in and of itself. In terms of whether for an average mile of driving, the robotaxi is safer than a human driver, that's a different question.
Yeah.
And the jury's out. It requires basically having a lot of data looking at very comparable types of driving by the robotaxi and the given driver. And we don't really have that now because the companies are so careful to keep
Yeah.
their data private. But let me just say this, like it is true, and this is what the robotaxi companies love to say, that a computer will never drive drunk, it'll never drive
Hmm.
distracted, it's not going to be on the phone while trying to navigate an intersection. All of that's true, and that's great. However, computers also make computer mistakes.
Yeah.
There are software errors, whatever, in situations where a human driver wouldn't make an error. Like, for example, that incident in San Francisco on October 2nd, where there was a person trapped beneath the cruise vehicle, and the vehicle was programmed to move to the side of the
Right.
street, get out of the way of traffic, even though this it's really gruesome. This woman is
Yeah.
was there. I think that if you or I, God forbid, found ourselves in that situation, we would know to just stop.
Right.
That's an example of a computer error, particularly nasty example
Yeah.
of the kind that we're going to see more of,
Yeah.
and
Well,
we
and
have
I
to take
think,
that into account.
yeah, and I think this safety question kind of dovetails nicely into the economics and business model. And really the question that I teased earlier, if this technology works. And, I think I kind of teased this earlier, right? The really, I guess the last one of the big things I want to talk to you about, like, if this technology works, let's not worry about the technology side and, all of that. But like, let's say that Cruise, I mean, I guess to me, the three options are Cruise and Waymo and these robo taxi companies, they get the cost down cheaper than an Uber or Lyft, right? Like cheaper than Ridehail, right?
Yeah,
Because they don't have a driver. And I think that's sort of been the line that they're saying. And, their pricing right now is cheaper, or they're at least trying to be cheaper than Uber Lyft. I'm sure they're losing boatloads of money, but I think that is their at least intended goal. I think to me, that's sort of like the worst, all of these effects that you talked about would be like magnified. I don't know how much, 5x, 10x. We could talk about that. Or,
Yeah.
I could also see though, even if they're the same price as current Ridehail, I think that there would still be a market for them. They could fit into a Ridehail fleet and kind of provide that baseline, even if they're
Yeah.
more expensive, right? There's, Lyft just launched a whole product called Women Connect, right? Or Lyft Connect, something like that, right? Where basically, hey, female riders and drivers don't feel safe sometimes late at night. So like, wouldn't you like to have an AV take you home? And maybe you're willing to, pay a premium for that. So I could sort of see there's some different levels. And obviously the different levels, I think their market
Yeah.
opportunity gets smaller and smaller, the more expensive it is. But what do you think about kind of like that business model and how it ties in to some of these, negative externalities that you talked about in your article?
Sorry, let me make sure I understand. You say the business model of, can you just clarify what you mean by business
Sure.
model? Make sure I
So,
get
I
it.
mean, basically, like, let's start with if robo taxis are cheaper than Uber and Lyft, like, how bad do you
Yeah,
think some of these issues will be?
got it. I think the issues will get a lot worse
Hmm.
because if taking a car trip is not only more convenient, at least for a lot of people, because they like, having the lack of driver, they have more privacy, but
Yeah.
it's also cheaper.
Yeah.
You're going to see a lot more car trips. Some will take the place of transit or biking or possibly walking, but a lot will also just be entirely new trips. And with additional trips or longer trips, also, it's
Yeah.
another point that's relevant. That's going to lead to more gridlock, more emissions, and more sprawl. So that would be bad.
Yeah. And so if you had to kind of go with your gut, where do you think robo taxis are going to end up? Do you think they're going to be much cheaper? Like, what should people be kind of worried about? Are they going to be much cheaper, about the same? Or you think probably not going to happen? If anything, they're going to be more expensive, not a big use case in the future.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, for one thing, we still have to get the technology question resolved
Yeah.
because it's not at all clear yet that robotaxis can scale safely in a lot of cities. That's the jury is out, shall we say? But let's say that we resolve it. That these things really are safe and
Yeah.
they're orders of magnitude safer than human drivers. I think you actually ask a really important question and one where again the ride hail experience can be illuminating because right now robotaxi trips are hugely subsidized.
Hmm.
Like those cars are expensive.
Yeah.
All that gadgetry and sensors and computers and the power that they require, that is some pricey stuff. So when you're paying, an amount that's comparable to a ride hail trip to take a Waymo to go 8 miles in Phoenix, you're getting a massive subsidy. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure people fully realize that. And, you know, you and I remember how 10 years ago, ride hail trips were a lot cheaper
Yeah.
than they are today on average because they were subsidized by venture capital dollars. And now they're public companies. They're not subsidized in the same way anymore. They're trying to break even.
Yeah.
So, from my perspective, if robotaxi companies do get the technology stuff sorted out, it actually works. The next question is going to be how do we actually move toward break even and profit?
Yeah.
And that has to mean reducing the subsidies, which is going to lead toward increasing prices. Like, yeah, they could have some efficiencies from software gain improvements or whatever, but you're going to have to increase the price. So I think that's actually an interesting lesson from
Yeah.
the ride hail experience, which is robotaxi fares may be on the way up and not that long.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a very good point because obviously, as you noted, the early days, all these Uber and Lyft trips were subsidized by VC, and I think a lot of people kind of expected them to be there forever. And I think the point I really like making this point with delivery, especially like if you want a human to go and pick up your food, bring it to your house, to your front door, like that is an expensive proposition, right? Like you can't get that for $4. You know what I mean? Like no one's doing that for $5, right? Like there are additional costs with ride hail, right? If you want a person to, sit around, wait for your request, pick you up in a nice car, I think that these costs really add up. And I think that, yeah, it's hard to say exactly, there's $200,000-300,000 of hardware, there's expensive engineers in the background, like, but I do think that lesson that like prices are going to go up for robotaxis in the future, maybe there will be less service area, right? Like I think there's going to be some trade-offs in the future. So if I was, on the city side or a customer or a driver, I think it's just good to kind of keep in mind, because we see a lot of people now like, oh man, Ubers and Lyfts have gotten so expensive. It's like, no, you're paying the actual cost now, right?
I think that's exactly right. And then I worry also that as Waymo and Cruise or whoever else is in the space feels more pressure to get toward profitability, that creates a whole lot more, all the more incentive to sort of flood the downtown area with vehicles, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like how Uber and Lyft drivers concentrate in vehicles, but in downtown areas, excuse me, but even more so. And just like we were saying a few minutes ago, when we were chatting, that's kind of like the last place that you want robotaxis
Yeah.
is, all around the Mission in San Francisco or in like Manhattan. Like that's
Yeah.
not where they're helpful. They could be helpful bringing people who have disabilities or lower incomes from outlying areas where transit service stinks to come into the city. But I'm not sure that the business model is going to naturally lead the robotaxi companies towards serving those kinds of people, just like it really hasn't led Ridehail in that direction either.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good point. Any other lessons from Ridehail from Ridehail that we can learn for robotaxis, or you think we've covered it all and this topic is done and dusted now?
I think the overarching argument I will say is, if you look at the robotaxi web pages now, you're going to see a lot about sustainability. You're going
Hmm.
to see a lot about, saving the planet. It's the same kind of message that we heard 15 years ago from Ridehail.
Yeah.
We know now that whether it was an intentional deceit or just lack of knowledge, and I think, the jury is out on that. Either way, it wasn't true what the Ridehail
Hmm.
companies claimed 15 years ago. Ridehail has not been a windfall for those of us who want to see emissions go down.
Yeah.
And I hope that there's a lesson there for people when you see Waymo and Cruise talk about how they're allies of environmentalists. I think that we can see through it and recognize that at this point, the Right Hill companies may have genuinely believed it and may have been
Hmm.
confused or just wrong in the end. But I actually think this is just a pure marketing ploy by
Yeah.
the robotaxi companies, and I don't think we should fall for it.
Got it. And I mean, do you think that there are maybe some to maybe even a lot of positives from both Ridehail and, the potential of robotaxis, but sustainability is clearly not one of them? Or do you think, the trade-offs aren't even worth it?
I'm still looking for the big benefit of robotaxis.
Hmm.
I I
Well, what about
I
Ridehail?
feel
Do you
like
think that there's some good benefits or?
that's Ride Hail's a little more nuanced for me.
Mm.
I wrote an essay about Ride Hail a couple months ago that I think you read about a book that was deeply critical called "Disrupting DC: The Rise of Uber and the Fall of
Yeah.
the City." I wrote an essay about my own experience being in DC, the DC mayor's office when Ride
Hmm.
Hail came to town. And like I'm pretty critical of Ride Hail, you know this, Harry, but this book actually went much further than me.
Yeah.
And even I will say that Ridehail was positive in when it first showed up 10 to
Hmm.
15 years ago by forcing such overdue reforms
Yeah.
in taxi services. Like it is so much easier to get from point A to point B in a
Yeah.
car that you don't own in San Francisco or New York or DC than it was 20 years ago. And I think that has everything to do with Uber and Lyft. So I will always credit Ridehail for forcing much needed innovation. However, we already got that innovation. Like we have that benefit now.
Yeah.
We don't need robotaxis to come and do it again. So that's why I sort of feel like I see both pros and cons from Ridehail's emergence. And with robotaxis, I definitely see the downsides, which we've talked about. And I'm still waiting for someone to make a compelling argument about the pros.
All right. Well, we'll leave that open. And if anyone out there is listening and wants to come on and share some pros, I think I've invited a couple folks from Cruise onto the podcast before. For some reason, they won't let me ride in one of the cars or come on the podcast, but there's an open invite. So,
I don't think they're doing a lot of I don't think Cruise is doing a lot of podcasts right now. It's
well,
not you.
my door's always open. So, David, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a fun episode, and I'm glad I could at least play a little part in inspiring the article. You can send me my cut of the royalty check later. And until next time.
Yeah, your cut of the royalties will cover maybe the next latte, I'm afraid. But let me just also say that if I mentioned a couple articles that we were
Yeah.
tagging today, so if people want to see those articles I've written, they're all at www.davidzipper.com. And if you want to get in contact, my DMs are always open on Twitter, which is still Twitter to me, not X. It's just at David Zipper. But it's always good to chat, Harry, and hope that whether this is my third or fourth time
Yeah.
on the rideshare guy, I hope it's not the last.
For sure. No, and I think if anyone enjoyed this episode and wants to hear more from David, we do have a bunch of episodes that we mentioned that we will link to in the show notes, a few of the articles that you mentioned. And then, yeah, I know you've got your website, davidzipper.com, and a newsletter, and you're quite active on Twitter. So lots of places to follow you and stay in the loop.
Sounds great. Always fun chatting with you, Harry.